The American Revolution history is dated back as far as April 1775. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire stretched its dominion from the bustling ports of India to the sun-drenched islands of the Caribbean, commanding a navy whose might had never been rivaled and an army disciplined in the art of war honed over centuries. Its wealth, extracted from colonies near and far, seemed inexhaustible. Ships of the line, bristling with cannons, cut through the oceans like living fortresses, while regiments of trained soldiers maintained order from the frozen frontiers of Canada to the tropical plantations of the West Indies. Britain's power was global, unyielding, and absolute, or so it appeared. Yet, on the eastern seaboard of North America, a series of scattered colonies, home to merely a fraction of the empire's population, were on the cusp of defiance. The seeds of what would become the American Revolution were about to erupt, and the world had yet to understand the scale of the transformation about to unfold. The question that hung in the air, both ominous and improbable, was this: how could a handful of colonial militias, inexperienced, underfunded, and scattered across hundreds of miles, hope to challenge the world's mightiest military machine? How could communities of farmers, merchants, artisans, and tradesmen accustomed to tending fields, managing shops, and navigating local disputes stand against a professional army trained to crush uprisings, enforce the will of the crown, and extend the reach of one of the largest empires in history? The answer would not lie in sheer military strength, but in the convergence of circumstance, ideology, leadership, and resolve, a combination that would render the improbable possible. The American Revolution would not be a mere rebellion. It would be a profound contest of ideas, endurance, and strategy, a struggle that fused practical grievances with a vision of liberty, self-governance, and the inalienable rights of individuals, principles that were radical even by the enlightened standards of the era. In the years leading up to 1775, the colonies had already begun to cultivate a sense of autonomy. They had local assemblies, town meetings, and community councils that made decisions about taxation, trade, and militia organization. These early forms of self-governance fostered a culture in which citizens expected to have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives, an expectation that increasingly clashed with the distant authority of a monarchy thousands of miles away. The colonies were not uniform in outlook. The wealthy merchants of Boston often found themselves in ideological conflict with frontier farmers or artisans in Pennsylvania. Yet, beneath these differences, a shared unease with British policy had begun to coalesce, a recognition that the Crown's reach had limits, and that its attempts to impose order and taxation without representation were increasingly intolerable. The ideological dimension of this impending struggle cannot be understated. The Enlightenment had introduced ideas of individual liberty, the social contract, and the notion that governments existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Thinkers such as John Locke had argued that citizens had the right, and, in some cases, the duty, to resist rulers who violated fundamental rights. These ideas were not abstract. They were alive in the pamphlets circulating through Boston, Philadelphia, and other colonial cities. Writers and activists such as Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Dickinson articulated grievances that were simultaneously practical and philosophical. The Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed taxes on legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards, sparked riots and boycotts. But it also crystallized the argument that taxation without representation was illegitimate. The Townshend Acts, the Tea Act of 1773, and the Punitive Coercive Acts of 1774 continued to inflame passions, giving concrete expression to abstract principles and laying the intellectual groundwork for revolution. Global dynamics amplified the significance of the American colonies. Britain's rivals, particularly France, had witnessed its victories and losses with keen interest. France, still smarting from defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw in the colonies unrest an opportunity to challenge Britain indirectly, weaken its empire, and regain lost prestige. Spain and the Netherlands monitored events carefully, understanding that shifts in North American power could have implications for their own colonies and trade routes. Every skirmish, every act of civil disobedience, echoed across the Atlantic. What might have seemed a local disturbance was, in reality, a potential pivot in global power politics. Yet the colonies faced enormous obstacles. The British Army and Navy were formidable, well-supplied, and experienced in continental warfare. Regiments were equipped with standardized muskets, cannons, and logistical networks that could sustain long campaigns far from home. Communication delays between London and Boston, New York, or Charleston sometimes hindered British response, but these were minor inconveniences relative to the military capacity arrayed against the colonists. Many inhabitants themselves remained loyal to the crown, relying on British trade for livelihood or fearing the uncertainties of rebellion. Internal divisions meant that the fight for independence would require not only facing an external adversary, but also negotiating internal allegiances and loyalties that were often fluid and precarious. Despite these daunting odds, several factors made revolution conceivable. Geography played a critical role. The vast distances between colonies and the Atlantic coast allowed local militias to operate with some autonomy, while the rough and varied terrain, forests, rivers, and hills favored guerrilla tactics over conventional European engagements. Knowledge of the land allowed colonists to stage ambushes, disrupt supply lines, and evade larger British forces. Ideology provided cohesion and justification, transforming mere dissatisfaction into a mission imbued with moral significance. Leaders who emerged during this period, George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and others, began to articulate not only the grievances of the colonies, but also a vision for a society governed by principles rather than kings. These figures became beacons, rallying support while navigating the treacherous terrain of political negotiation and military strategy. April 1775 brought these forces to a head. In Massachusetts, tensions that had simmered for over a decade erupted into armed confrontation. British authorities sought to confiscate colonial arms and arrest key leaders, miscalculating the resolve of local militias. These militias, organized at the town and county level, prepared for confrontation, understanding that compromise might no longer be possible. The stage was set not only for a battle over territory and arms, but for a confrontation of ideas. Empire versus self-determination, hierarchy versus consent, tradition versus innovation. The ensuing conflict would prove that even a small, determined population could challenge an empire whose power had seemed unassailable. The American Revolution was not simply a military conflict. It was an experiment in the possibilities of governance and human agency. It questioned centuries-old assumptions about the legitimacy of rulers, the rights of subjects, and the responsibilities of citizens. Ordinary men and women, farmers, merchants, enslaved individuals, and indigenous people would find themselves actors in a drama of global significance. Each decision, each skirmish, each political maneuver contributed to a process that would redefine not only the relationship between colonies and empire, but also the broader principles by which nations govern themselves. As the colonies mobilized, the eyes of the world turned, often unknowingly, toward New England, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia. The battles to come, beginning in the towns of Lexington and Concord, would set a precedent that reverberated far beyond the Atlantic. The revolution was an improbable endeavor, yet it was propelled by a unique confluence of circumstance, intellect, and audacity. It was a story of risk and vision, where people, believing in principles greater than themselves, challenged the most powerful military force of their era. This is the story of the American Revolution, not merely April 1763 marked the end of the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that had reshaped empires and redrawn the maps of Europe and North America. For Great Britain, victory over France had secured enormous territorial gains in North America, including Canada and lands east of the Mississippi River. Yet, the spoils of war came at a staggering cost. The British government faced debts so immense that they threatened the very stability of the empire. The Crown looked across the Atlantic to its 13 colonies. The first major flashpoint came in 1765 with the Stamp Act, a law mandating that nearly all printed materials, from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards, carry a tax stamp purchased from British authorities. For the colonists, the act was more than a fiscal measure. It symbolized a fundamental violation of rights. Leaders like Patrick Henry, James Otis, and Samuel Adams decried the act in fiery speeches and pamphlets, arguing that taxation without representation was tyranny. Across the colonies, riots erupted, effigies of British officials were burned, and merchants boycotted imported goods. The Stamp Act Congress convened in October 1765, uniting representatives from 9 colonies in a coordinated challenge to the Crown, demonstrating the first real intercolonial solidarity against British policies. Though the act was eventually repealed in 1766, the resentment it generated lingered, and a new phrase entered the political lexicon: no taxation without representation. The following year saw a series of measures designed to reassert imperial authority while attempting to raise revenue. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties on essential imports like glass, paper, paint, and tea. These taxes reignited colonial protests, leading to widespread boycotts and the formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty, who employed both persuasion and intimidation to enforce colonial opposition. The acts also provoked a significant ideological response, with thinkers such as John Dickinson, in his influential Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, arguing that Parliament could not tax the colonies for revenue without their consent. These writings circulated widely, educating a generation of colonists on the principles of natural rights, consent of the governed, and legal limitations on imperial authority. Tensions escalated further in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, an event that would become a touchstone of revolutionary rhetoric. On March 5th, British soldiers, stationed in Boston to enforce order, fired upon a crowd of civilians, killing 5 men. The incident was seized upon by colonial leaders as evidence of British tyranny and brutality. Pamphlets and engravings, including Paul Revere's iconic depiction of the event, spread rapidly, inflaming public opinion and cultivating a shared sense of grievance. Though the soldiers were tried and acquitted of murder, the massacre had a lasting psychological effect, underscoring the dangers of an occupying military force and the potential for violence in the colonies. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, designed to bail out the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices, undercutting local merchants. While seemingly beneficial economically, the act was perceived as another attempt to assert parliamentary authority, provoking the now iconic Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773. In a dramatic act of defiance, members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was more than a protest. It was a deliberate, calculated act of political theater, symbolizing the colony's willingness to defy imperial law and challenging Britain to respond. The British response was swift and punitive. In 1774, Parliament enacted the Coercive Acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, designed to reassert control over Massachusetts. The measures included closing Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, altering the Massachusetts Charter to reduce self-governance, and allowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried elsewhere. These acts were intended to isolate and punish Massachusetts, but they had the opposite effect. They united the colonies in opposition. The First Continental Congress convened in September 1774 in Philadelphia, bringing together delegates from 12 colonies to coordinate resistance. They petitioned the king for redress, organized economic boycotts, and began planning collective defensive measures, signaling a move from protest to organized resistance. Throughout these years, leadership emerged not only from the political elite, but also from ordinary colonists who became key figures in the revolutionary movement. Samuel Adams exemplified the power of local organization, mobilizing networks of committees to enforce boycotts and coordinate communication across the colonies. Patrick Henry, with his memorable declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death," articulated the emotional and ideological core of resistance, inspiring both militias and civilians. John Dickinson, though more cautious, provided a legalistic and philosophical foundation for opposition, helping to articulate arguments that would later influence the Declaration of Independence. Their combined efforts reflected a growing sophistication in colonial political strategy, balancing direct action, propaganda, and diplomacy. By the eve of 1775, the colonies were politically, socially, and militarily primed for confrontation. Militias drilled regularly, storing weapons in anticipation of a potential clash. Towns and cities buzzed with debate over rights, governance, and loyalty. Pamphlets and newspapers spread revolutionary ideas, while networks of correspondence kept distant communities informed and coordinated. The colonies were no longer passive subjects of an imperial power. They were politically aware, strategically organized, and ideologically committed. The groundwork had been laid for a revolution, but whether it could succeed against the might of Britain remained uncertain. The British perspective was starkly different. Officials in London viewed colonial protests as isolated, temporary disturbances, failing to recognize the depth of ideological commitment among the colonists. They underestimated the ability of local militias to organize, communicate, and sustain resistance. To British generals and parliamentarians, the colonies' reliance on Britain for trade, defense, and law seemed to ensure loyalty. Yet, this miscalculation ignored the evolving sense of identity among colonists, who increasingly saw themselves as Americans rather than merely British subjects, with rights and responsibilities independent of parliamentary decree. Economic pressures also contributed to the revolutionary climate. Britain's insistence on controlling trade through regulations such as the Navigation Acts created friction with merchants accustomed to relative autonomy. Smuggling became commonplace as colonists sought to evade taxes and restrictions, demonstrating both their resourcefulness and their growing disregard for imperial authority. These economic behaviors, combined with ideological opposition and local militias, created a volatile mix, a society primed for confrontation, yet highly adaptive in its strategies for resistance. As 1775 approached, the situation reached a critical juncture. British attempts to seize colonial arms and enforce unpopular laws, coupled with the colonies' growing sense of autonomy and ideological resolve, made conflict inevitable. What began as a decade of protests, boycotts, and philosophical debate was about to transform into armed struggle. The colonies stood on the threshold of revolution, not because of a single grievance or event, but because of a decade-long accumulation of political, economic, and social pressures that had fundamentally altered the relationship between Britain and its American subjects. This period, the prelude to war, illustrates the complex interplay of ideas, strategy, and circumstance that defined the American Revolution. It was a revolution not only of arms, but of the mind. Colonists had learned to organize, communicate, and act collectively, and they were guided by principles that challenged centuries of monarchical authority. They were prepared, in ways both practical and ideological, to embark on a path that would lead to war, independence, and a profound reimagining of governance. By 1775, the stage was set. The colonies were ready to defy the world's mightiest empire, and the first shots of a conflict that would reshape history were about to be fired. On the morning of April 19, 1775, the quiet towns of eastern Massachusetts awakened to the distant sound of drums and the measured march of British troops advancing from Boston toward Concord. These were not ordinary soldiers passing through a colony on routine patrol. They were disciplined regiments of the British Army, trained in European warfare, carrying muskets, bayonets, and orders from the Crown to seize colonial arms and munitions. The British command believed that the confiscation of these weapons would quell growing unrest and demonstrate the futility of rebellion. What they did not anticipate was the organization, determination, and courage of local militias who had been quietly preparing for this day for years, aware that confrontation might be inevitable. The towns of Lexington and Concord had become symbols of colonial resistance. Citizens there had been quietly stockpiling weapons, from muskets to powder, in barns, homes, and local armories. Committees of correspondence, which had emerged across Massachusetts and the other colonies, had established. Historians have debated for centuries who fired it, but its impact was indisputable. It became forever known as the shot heard around the world. The skirmish at Lexington was brief but decisive in its symbolic importance. 8 colonists fell, and several more were wounded. Though tactically a small encounter, it demonstrated the colonists' willingness to stand against a professional army. From Lexington, the British troops advanced to Concord, only to encounter a more determined and organized resistance. At Concord's North Bridge, militias had taken positions, prepared to defend the town's armories. When the British attempted to seize the weapons, the Minutemen opened fire, forcing the soldiers into retreat. The countryside erupted as local farmers and townspeople joined the militias, turning what was intended as a swift operation into a harrowing withdrawal for the British. The retreat from Concord to Boston became a bloody and chaotic march, with colonial forces harassing the British column along the way. Militias employed tactics that would become hallmarks of the Revolutionary struggle: ambushes from behind stone walls and trees, sharpshooting from concealed positions, and rapid, coordinated attacks designed to exploit the terrain and the enemy's rigid formations. Casualties mounted for the British, and their advance guards suffered significantly more than in traditional European engagements of the time. By the time the remnants of the force returned to Boston, it was clear that the colonists had transformed from a disorganized protest into an effective armed resistance. News of the skirmishes spread like wildfire. In the days that followed, militias across Massachusetts mobilized, surrounding Boston and effectively placing the city under siege. The confrontations at Lexington and Concord had shattered the illusion of colonial passivity and demonstrated that Britain's authority could be challenged successfully, at least on local terrain. The events galvanized the other colonies, uniting them in purpose and urgency. Leaders in Philadelphia and New York recognized the importance of rapid coordination, and the Continental Congress was convened in May 1775 to organize a collective response to the crisis. The political implications were as profound as the military ones. What began as a local dispute between colonial militias and British troops had escalated into an open challenge to imperial authority. Loyalists and moderates faced difficult choices: align with the Crown, maintain neutrality, or support the revolutionary cause. The intensity of the Lexington and Concord encounters forced these decisions into the open, polarizing communities and families, and setting the stage for a war that would engulf the entire eastern seaboard. In Boston, British forces, now wary of their precarious position, reinforced the city with additional regiments and fortified strategic points. Yet, they were besieged not by overwhelming numbers, but by the determination of local militias who had surrounded the city from the countryside, cutting off supply lines and communications. The Siege of Boston, which would last until March 1776, demonstrated the strategic importance of the countryside and the ability of irregular forces to impose constraints on a conventional army. It also revealed the critical role of leadership, organization, and morale in sustaining resistance under pressure. The broader strategic context of these events cannot be overlooked. Across the Atlantic, Britain had global commitments, territories in the Caribbean, North America, India, and beyond. The empire relied on its ability to project power quickly, but the logistical realities of 18th century warfare meant that reinforcements and supplies could take weeks or months to arrive. The colonies' geographical dispersal and familiarity with local terrain provided a significant advantage, allowing militias to exploit the limitations of a European-style army. What occurred at Lexington and Concord was a demonstration of how localized resistance, when coordinated effectively, could challenge even the most powerful military force on Earth. The ideological dimension was equally critical. The confrontations illustrated the colonies' commitment not just to local grievances, but to broader principles of governance and liberty. Pamphlets and newspapers recounted the battles, framing them as a moral struggle against tyranny. Figures like John Adams and Samuel Adams argued that the right to bear arms and resist unlawful authority was inherent, not granted by Parliament or the Crown. These ideas resonated deeply with ordinary colonists, providing the moral and philosophical justification for armed resistance. Lexington and Concord were thus both a military and symbolic victory. They validated the notion that resistance was possible, necessary, and morally defensible. In the weeks following the skirmishes, militias across New England and beyond began to organize more formally, consolidating local companies into regiments and appointing experienced officers where possible. Training intensified, supply lines were established, and communication networks expanded. What had been a spontaneous action transformed into a coordinated effort capable of sustained military engagement. Colonial leaders understood that the coming struggle would require more than courage. It would demand planning, discipline, and strategic vision. The British, for their part, reevaluated their assumptions about colonial loyalty and military capability. Initial orders had treated the colonies as quiescent subjects who might resist minimally, if at all. Lexington and Concord proved otherwise. The empire recognized that suppressing the rebellion would require a sustained commitment of troops and resources, potentially diverting attention from other theaters of the empire. The realization that the colonies were capable of effective armed resistance marked a turning point in British strategic thinking and forced a recalibration of military objectives in North America. Lexington and Concord also catalyzed political innovation. In response to the escalating crisis, the Continental Congress began to establish frameworks for governance, logistics, and military oversight. Committees were formed to procure arms, negotiate with sympathetic foreign powers, and coordinate the increasingly unified efforts of the colonies. These measures demonstrated that the revolution was evolving from a collection of local protests into a national movement with organizational and institutional depth. The skirmishes were not isolated incidents, but the opening chapter of a conflict that would engulf the colonies for 8 years. By the end of April 1775, it was clear that the world had changed. A small contingent of colonial militias had successfully challenged a professional army, demonstrating that the combination of local knowledge, coordination, and moral conviction could offset the advantages of training, equipment, and numbers. The battles had set a precedent for the conduct of revolutionary warfare, flexible, adaptive, and intimately tied to the landscape and communities in which it occurred. The symbolic and practical significance of these events could not be overstated. They marked the irreversible transition from political protest to armed revolution. The events at Lexington and Concord remain central to the historical narrative of the American Revolution. because they encapsulate the convergence of multiple forces: ideology, leadership, local initiative, and the limits of imperial power. They demonstrate how ordinary individuals, motivated by principle and circumstance, can challenge seemingly insurmountable authority. The courage and resolve exhibited by colonial militias provided the spark that ignited a broader struggle, inspiring confidence and unity among the colonies, while forcing Britain to confront the reality of a rebellion that would not be easily quelled. In retrospect, April 19, 1775, represents more than a battle. It is a symbol of the American Revolution itself. It was a moment when ideas, preparation, and circumstance collided with military force, producing an outcome that neither side could have fully anticipated. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord transformed the political landscape of the colonies, setting in motion a series of events that would lead to the declaration of independence, a global conflict with European powers, and ultimately the creation of a new nation founded on principles that would reverberate for centuries. The revolution had begun not with sweeping campaigns or grand declarations, but with the courage of ordinary men standing on a small-town green, willing to challenge the world's most formidable empire. In the wake of the confrontations at Lexington and Concord, the 13 colonies found themselves thrust into a conflict that was no longer theoretical, no longer a matter of political negotiation or protest. The events of April 19, 1775, had demonstrated that ordinary men, armed only with courage, muskets, and a familiarity with their local terrain, could stand against trained British regiments. Yet, isolated skirmishes could not win a war against the world's preeminent military power. What was needed was organization, leadership, and a vision for coordinated resistance across the colonies. It was against this backdrop that the Continental Congress convened and began to lay the foundations for what would become the Continental Army. By June 1775, the Second Continental Congress had recognized the necessity of a unified military command. Delegates from the colonies debated not only the appointment of officers, but also the very nature of the force they intended to create. These were not professional soldiers, and the colonies lacked the financial infrastructure to equip and maintain a standing army in the European sense. Yet, the Congress understood that without a central command, the disparate militias scattered across New England would remain vulnerable to isolation and defeat. On June 15, 1775, they appointed George Washington, a 39-year-old planter from Virginia and veteran of the French and Indian War, as commander-in-chief. Washington's selection was both practical and symbolic. He possessed military experience, the respect of his peers, and, as a Virginian, he helped bridge the emerging divide between New England and the southern colonies. Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775 to assume command of a force that was a patchwork of local militias, volunteers, and civilian recruits. Numbers were difficult to ascertain, but estimates suggest that the army initially comprised around 14,000 men, many of whom had little to no formal training. Discipline was uneven, supplies were scarce, and pay was irregular. Tents, uniforms, and weapons were often improvised or borrowed, and the army relied heavily on the resourcefulness and resilience of its leaders and soldiers. Washington understood immediately that his greatest challenge would not only be to organize and train the army, but to instill a sense of shared purpose among men who had been accustomed to acting independently and locally. The early months of Washington's command were defined by improvisation, experimentation, and a relentless focus on morale. He traveled frequently among the encampments, inspecting positions, drilling troops, and establishing standards for conduct and discipline. The army lacked formal artillery at first, and supply chains were rudimentary, requiring reliance on local communities for food, clothing, and ammunition. Washington's leadership emphasized adaptability. He recognized that conventional European tactics might not be suitable against a British army accustomed to linear formations and open field engagements. Instead, he encouraged the use of skirmishing, entrenchments, and the clever use of terrain, principles that would define much of the Revolution's military strategy. One of Washington's first strategic challenges was the Siege of Boston, which had begun in April 1775 as local militias encircled the city following the battles at Lexington and Concord. British troops occupied the city but were confined, unable to move freely without risking harassment by the surrounding militias. The siege was a war of patience and logistics as much as of combat. Colonial forces were spread across key points around Boston, maintaining observation and defensive positions while Washington worked to consolidate command, train troops, and acquire artillery. The situation demanded ingenuity. Without sufficient heavy weaponry, it was impossible to force a decisive engagement with the British. A turning point in the siege came in March 1776 with the strategic deployment of artillery captured from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. Led by Henry Knox, an audacious 25-year-old artillery officer, a fleet of cannons was transported across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, through winter snows and icy rivers, to positions overlooking Boston. The arrival of these guns dramatically altered the balance of power. Washington placed them on Dorchester Heights, commanding the harbor and threatening the British ships and positions within the city. Confronted with this formidable display of firepower and unwilling to risk massive casualties, British General William Howe decided to evacuate Boston on March 17, 1776. This was the Continental Army's first major strategic success, achieved without a full-scale battle, demonstrating Washington's ability to leverage limited resources with strategic insight. Despite this early success, the Continental Army remained fragile. Recruitment was an ongoing challenge, as enlistments were often short-term, ranging from months to a year. Desertion, illness, and inadequate supplies continually threatened cohesion. Many troops lacked proper uniforms, shoes, or even blankets. Disease was rampant, and winter encampments tested the limits of endurance. Yet, these hardships forged resilience and camaraderie, qualities that would prove essential in the campaigns to come. Washington's leadership style, emphasizing personal example, fairness, and attention to the welfare of his men, helped maintain morale during these trying times. The Army's structure evolved. Initially organized by colony, with units retaining local identities, it gradually incorporated a more standardized hierarchy: regiments, brigades, and divisions under appointed generals. Officers were selected based on experience, competence, and sometimes political considerations, with figures like Nathanael Greene, Henry Knox, and Israel Putnam emerging as key leaders. Training became more systematic, incorporating musket drills, artillery practice, and tactical exercises designed to prepare men for conventional and irregular warfare. Washington understood that victory would require both the courage of volunteers and the discipline of a professional force. The Continental Army's formation also had profound political implications. It signaled that the colonies were committed to armed resistance, and that this resistance required unity and coordination beyond individual towns or regions. The Army became a symbol of collective identity, a tangible expression of the colony's determination to resist British authority. It also demonstrated to Britain that the conflict was escalating beyond isolated rebellions into a coordinated military struggle that demanded serious attention. The creation of a centralized command under Washington helped unify disparate colonial efforts and laid the foundation for strategic planning across the theater of war. Financial and logistical support for the Army was a constant concern. The Continental Congress lacked the power to levy taxes, relying instead on requisitions from the colonies, donations from sympathetic merchants, and the printing of currency, which often led to inflation. These challenges highlighted the interdependence of military and civilian efforts. Local communities provided crucial support, supplying food, clothing, and shelter, while also contributing to morale by demonstrating their commitment to the revolutionary cause. The Army's survival depended not only on battlefield tactics, but on the sustained cooperation of a politically engaged and supportive population. Washington's early experiences underscored the revolutionary principle that military success was inseparable from political legitimacy. The Army was not a mercenary force, but a representative institution, drawing authority from the consent of the colonies and the Continental Congress. Officers were accountable not only to military necessity, but to the people they represented. This connection between governance and military organization reflected a broader ideological framework. The fight against Britain was as much about securing rights and self-determination as it was about territorial control. Throughout the formation of the Continental Army, the challenges of command were immense. Washington had to balance competing personalities, regional rivalries, and limited resources while maintaining strategic vision and operational coherence. Yet, his steady hand, strategic patience, and ability to inspire loyalty helped transform a patchwork of militias into a unified force capable of confronting the British Army. The early months of the Army's existence demonstrated the interplay between leadership, ideology, and practical organization that would define the revolutionary struggle for the next 8 years. The creation of the Continental Army also set precedents that would shape American military and political culture. It demonstrated the necessity of combining professional organization with popular participation, discipline with moral purpose, and strategic planning with improvisation. It illustrated that effective resistance required both material preparation and ideological commitment. In essence, the Army became a crucible in which the revolutionary identity of the colonies was forged, a disciplined, resilient, and ideologically motivated force capable of challenging the world's most powerful empire. By March 1776, the Continental Army had proven that it could achieve strategic objectives, as evidenced by the successful evacuation of British forces from Boston. Yet, the challenges ahead, expanding operations beyond New England, confronting the British in major cities, and sustaining a long-term conflict, remained daunting. The Army's formation had been the essential first step, providing the structure, leadership, and organizational capacity needed to transform a rebellion into a revolution. Washington's vision and the collective effort of the colonies had created not just a fighting force, but a symbol of unity, determination, and the belief that ordinary men and women could shape the course of history. The formation of the Continental Army in 1775 was more than a military necessity. It was a statement of intent. It represented the colonies' transition from protest to organized resistance, from regional militias to a unified national effort. It demonstrated the colonies' capacity for leadership, coordination, and innovation under extraordinary circumstances. And it established George Washington as a central figure whose judgment, patience, and resolve would become pivotal in guiding the colonies through the trials of war. The Army's creation marked the first tangible step toward independence, signaling to Britain and the world that the colonies were prepared to defend their rights, their communities, and their vision for a new nation, no matter the cost. The years following the formation of the Continental Army were a test of endurance, strategy, and sheer resolve. The fledgling army, composed largely of farmers, tradesmen, and volunteers, faced an enemy whose reputation for discipline, training, and firepower was unmatched. Yet, despite these overwhelming odds, the revolution began to demonstrate that courage, ingenuity. The first major confrontation occurred at Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775. Though often misnamed, the principal fighting actually took place on Breed's Hill. This battle became a symbol of colonial resolve. Approximately 1,200 colonial troops, hastily fortified and led by inexperienced officers such as Colonel William Prescott, prepared defensive positions overlooking Boston Harbor. They understood that the British would advance in traditional formations, confident in their ability to rout militia forces with volleys of musket fire. The British, under General William Howe, launched a frontal assault, expecting an easy victory. What they encountered was a force willing to stand firm, delivering disciplined musket volleys and taking advantage of elevated positions to maximize effectiveness. Despite eventually being forced to retreat due to depleted ammunition, the colonial forces inflicted over 1,000 casualties on the British, who suffered more losses than the Americans. Bunker Hill demonstrated that colonial militias could challenge professional troops and provided a psychological boost to the revolutionary cause, even in tactical defeat. Following Bunker Hill, the war's focus shifted to broader strategic considerations. The British sought to regain the initiative by consolidating control over major cities, particularly New York, which held immense logistical and symbolic significance. In the summer of 1776, British forces under General William Howe landed on Long Island, forcing the Continental Army into a series of withdrawals across New Jersey. The Americans faced harsh conditions. They were poorly supplied, fatigued, and often outnumbered. Morale waned, and there were moments when the revolution seemed on the brink of collapse. Yet, Washington's leadership during these retreats exemplified patience and strategic foresight. Rather than risking annihilation in conventional battles, he preserved his army, maintaining cohesion for the campaigns that would follow. In late December 1776, Washington orchestrated one of the most daring maneuvers of the war, the crossing of the Delaware River. Facing freezing conditions and a formidable ice-choked river, Washington led roughly 2,400 men across the water on the night of December 25th to 26th, aiming to surprise a garrison of Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. The attack was meticulously planned, relying on stealth, speed, and the element of surprise. The victory at Trenton was both tactical and symbolic. It revitalized the Continental Army, demonstrating that bold action could compensate for numerical and material disadvantages. The success also inspired recruitment and renewed commitment from wavering troops, setting the stage for a series of winter campaigns that would further challenge British assumptions about the conflict. Shortly thereafter, Washington followed up with another critical engagement at Princeton, further destabilizing British positions in New Jersey and forcing a temporary withdrawal of their forces toward New York. These victories were not large in terms of casualties, but their psychological and strategic impact was profound. They exemplified a revolutionary approach to warfare, one that prioritized mobility, surprise, and the effective use of local knowledge over conventional European tactics. The early winter campaigns of 1776 to 1777 showcased the adaptability of the Continental Army and the importance of leadership in sustaining morale, cohesion, and operational effectiveness under extreme conditions. While these victories were pivotal, the war's broader strategic landscape required the Americans to engage in a complex and often improvised series of maneuvers. The British sought to leverage their superior numbers and naval power, attempting to isolate the colonies and control key ports and cities. In contrast, the Americans relied on interior lines, local militias, and an emerging intelligence network to harass and disrupt British operations. Skirmishes, raids, and reconnaissance became essential components of the conflict, allowing colonial forces to compensate for deficiencies in artillery, fortifications, and supply. Figures like Nathanael Greene, Daniel Morgan, and Henry Knox emerged as commanders capable of combining tactical innovation with disciplined execution, further enhancing the Army's capabilities. The ideological dimension of these early campaigns cannot be understated. Each engagement served as a practical manifestation of the principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, which would follow in July 1776. Soldiers and civilians alike were aware that their struggle was not merely for territory or local autonomy, but for a vision of self-governance and liberty. The victories at Trenton and Princeton, alongside the tenacity displayed at Bunker Hill, reinforced the legitimacy of the revolutionary cause both domestically and abroad. They sent a message to potential allies in Europe that the American forces were capable, committed, and resilient, a crucial factor in securing future support. Casualties, hardships, and logistical challenges continued to shape the Army's experience. Disease, exposure, and limited provisions exacted a heavy toll, particularly during prolonged campaigns and winter encampments. Yet, these hardships fostered resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity. Soldiers learned to adapt to scarcity, to maintain operational readiness under duress, and to rely on local communities for support. Civilians, in turn, were drawn into the war effort, supplying food, shelter, and intelligence. The lines between military and civilian life blurred, illustrating the deeply integrated nature of revolutionary society and the shared stakes in the struggle against British authority. The early years of the Revolution also highlighted the critical importance of intelligence, communication, and diplomacy. Committees of correspondence, scouts, and local informants provided timely information on British movements, allowing Washington and other commanders to make strategic decisions with greater accuracy. At the same time, the fledgling Continental Congress worked to coordinate military planning, procurement, and the maintenance of alliances among the colonies. This integration of political and military efforts underscored the complexity of the revolutionary struggle. It was a war fought not only on battlefields but in courthouses, assemblies, and correspondence networks across the continent. By 1777, the Continental Army had transitioned from a reactive force to one capable of shaping its own strategic environment. The early battles and maneuvers had honed its leaders, tested its troops, and established patterns of mobility, surprise, and tactical innovation that would continue throughout the war. Washington's insistence on preserving his army, maintaining discipline, and leveraging limited resources had created a foundation upon which future victories could be built. The lessons learned during this period about leadership, coordination, and the integration of political and military objectives would prove essential in the campaigns that followed, including the pivotal confrontation at Saratoga. The early turning points of the war also underscored the importance of morale and perception. Each engagement, whether a skirmish or a larger battle, carried symbolic weight. Successes bolstered recruitment, reinforced political resolve, and demonstrated to European observers that the colonies were a credible military entity. Failures, while inevitable, served as learning opportunities, highlighting weaknesses in training, supply, and coordination. The American Revolution was as much a psychological struggle as a physical one, and the ability of colonial forces to endure, adapt, and exploit opportunities proved decisive in maintaining the momentum necessary for sustained resistance. In retrospect, the period from Bunker Hill through the campaigns in New Jersey represents a critical phase in the American Revolution. It was a time when the Continental Army, under Washington's leadership, evolved from a loosely organized militia into a disciplined and adaptive fighting force. It was a period defined by improvisation, resilience, and the integration of military, political, and ideological efforts. The successes and setbacks of these early engagements demonstrated that the revolution was more than a local rebellion. It was a coordinated struggle with global implications, capable of challenging the military and political might of the British Empire. The early battles and campaigns of the Revolution also set enduring precedents for the conduct of warfare. The use of terrain, mobility, and surprise, combined with the integration of civilian support and intelligence networks, illustrated a revolutionary approach that diverged from conventional European practices. This adaptability allowed the Continental Army to mitigate the advantages of British training, numbers, and artillery, proving that unconventional strategy could compensate for material and logistical limitations. It was an approach that would continue to define the war and contribute to its ultimate success. As 1777 approached, the lessons of these early engagements informed both strategy and leadership. Washington and his generals had learned to balance aggression with caution, to exploit opportunities while avoiding unnecessary risk, and to maintain the cohesion and morale of an army composed largely of volunteers. The early campaigns had demonstrated that the colonies could endure hardship, adapt to evolving circumstances, and strike decisively when conditions were favorable. These experiences laid the groundwork for subsequent victories and for the broader international recognition and support that would prove crucial in the years to come. The early battles and strategic maneuvers of the Revolution, therefore, were not merely episodes of conflict. They were formative experiences that defined the character, capabilities, and identity of the Continental Army. They demonstrated that a determined, ideologically committed force, under capable leadership and with strategic ingenuity, could challenge the most powerful military in the world. These turning points, though often measured in tactical details and localized engagements, carried profound symbolic, political, and strategic significance, shaping the trajectory of a revolution that would change the course of history. By the summer of 1776, the 13 American colonies were no longer merely in rebellion. They were on the brink of transformation. Months of conflict, skirmishes, and hard-fought victories had hardened resolve and forged a shared sense of identity among colonists who had once considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Crown. The battles of Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Princeton had proven that militias, under capable leadership, could challenge the seemingly invincible British military. Yet, the Revolution was not solely a military struggle. It was a contest of ideas, principles, and legitimacy. It was within this crucible of conflict and conviction that the Continental Congress moved toward an unprecedented act, the Declaration of Independence. The notion of independence was not universally accepted at the outset. Delegates to the Second Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, represented a spectrum of opinions. Some advocated for reconciliation with Britain, seeking only redress for grievances and the restoration of rights within the imperial framework. Others, increasingly influenced by the writings of philosophers like John Locke, argued that the colonies possessed natural rights that no distant parliament could justly infringe. Leaders such as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Richard Henry Lee began to coalesce around the idea that independence was not merely desirable but necessary for the preservation of liberty, property, and self-determination. Throughout the winter and spring of 1776, debates intensified. Influential pamphlets circulated among the colonies, shaping public opinion and clarifying ideological positions. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, became a catalyst for revolutionary thought. Its plain-spoken arguments rejected monarchy as an illegitimate form of government and called for a sovereign, self-governing republic. Paine's work resonated across social classes, bridging the gap between elite political leaders and ordinary colonists. It framed independence not as radical or dangerous, but as a rational and moral response to tyranny. The pamphlet's influence cannot be overstated. It crystallized a popular consensus that would provide the moral and political foundation for the formal declaration. By June 1776, momentum toward independence had become irreversible. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution to Congress asserting that the colonies ought to be free and independent states. This motion set in motion the drafting of a formal declaration. A committee was appointed, composed of Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson, then just 33 years old, was tasked with the primary drafting, bringing together a vision of political philosophy, natural rights, and grievances against King George III into a cohesive and compelling document. His work drew heavily on Enlightenment principles, particularly the notion that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed and exist to protect inherent rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The drafting process was both collaborative and deliberate. Jefferson's original manuscript underwent scrutiny and revision by Adams, Franklin, and other members of Congress, who refined language, strengthened arguments, and ensured that the grievances against Britain were clearly articulated. The document enumerated the colony's complaints: taxation without representation, interference with local governance, obstruction of justice, maintenance of standing armies in peacetime without consent, and a host of other perceived violations of colonial rights. These grievances were not abstract. They were the culmination of a decade-long escalation of tensions, from the Stamp Act to the Coercive Acts, illustrating a consistent pattern of overreach by the British government. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted in favor of Richard Henry Lee's resolution, formally declaring that the colonies were independent states. 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. While the vote itself was an act of legal and political authority, the document's broader significance lay in its articulation of revolutionary principles. It was not merely a statement of secession. It was a manifesto of political philosophy, declaring that all men are created equal, that governments exist to secure unalienable rights, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. These words resonated far beyond the immediate context of the 13 colonies, offering a new vision of governance and legitimacy that would inspire movements worldwide. The Declaration's adoption was both symbolic and practical. Symbolically, it represented a formal break from centuries of British rule and asserted the colonies' right to self-determination. Practically, it provided a legal and political framework for the revolution, allowing the Continental Congress to act as the governing authority of a new nation. It authorized the raising of armies, the negotiation of treaties, and the mobilization of resources, effectively transforming the rebellion into a national war effort. The Declaration also clarified the colony's objectives to foreign powers, a critical step in securing international recognition and support, particularly from France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The public reading and dissemination of the Declaration throughout the colonies amplified its impact. Town criers, newspapers, and pamphlets ensured that the ideas contained within their texts reached a broad audience. Citizens across the 13 states engaged with the document, discussing its principles, debating its implications, and increasingly seeing themselves not merely as colonial subjects, but as members of an emerging nation. The Declaration provided a unifying narrative, binding disparate communities, economic classes, and regional identities together under the common cause of independence. Yet, the path to independence was neither smooth nor universally embraced. Loyalists, who remained committed to the crown, constituted a significant portion of the population. They feared the consequences of rebellion, distrusted revolutionary leaders, and often clashed with their neighbors and local militias. Native American nations and enslaved populations viewed the conflict through the lens of their own survival and autonomy, and their positions were complex and varied. The revolutionary leadership had to navigate these internal divisions while maintaining focus on the broader strategic objective of resisting British authority. The declaration also had profound implications for military strategy and morale. It transformed the Continental Army from a collection of militias defending local communities into the armed forces of a sovereign nation fighting for recognized political and moral claims. Soldiers were no longer merely defending homes or local interests. They were fighting for a declared nation with a clear vision of political legitimacy and moral purpose. This ideological grounding strengthened resolve, provided justification for enduring hardship, and helped sustain commitment in the face of immense challenges, including shortages, disease, and the ever-present threat of defeat. Internationally, the Declaration of Independence marked a turning point in global perception of the American conflict. European powers, long skeptical of the colonies' ability to resist Britain, began to recognize the seriousness of the revolutionary cause. France, in particular, saw an opportunity to weaken Britain and began to provide covert support, supplying arms, funds, and intelligence. The clear articulation of political principles and grievances made the American cause understandable and morally compelling to foreign observers, paving the way for formal alliances that would prove decisive in subsequent years. The philosophical and legal language of the Declaration also set a precedent that would influence generations. Its articulation of universal rights, government by consent, and the moral responsibility of citizens to resist tyranny provided a framework that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. The principles embedded within the document would resonate during the French Revolution, inspire independence movements across Latin America, and shape political thought in Europe and beyond. The adoption of the Declaration was thus both a culmination of colonial struggle and a beginning, a foundational statement of values for a nation yet to be fully realized. In the months following July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress, military leaders, and colonial governments worked to translate the ideals of independence into practical measures. Recruitment intensified, supply chains were organized, and military strategy was aligned with the new reality of open rebellion. The Declaration provided a shared framework for governance and military coordination, ensuring that the revolution could proceed as a concerted, strategic effort rather than a series of isolated skirmishes. It was a blueprint for nationhood, even as the outcome of the conflict remained uncertain. The Declaration of Independence thus represents a pivotal moment in the American Revolution, where ideology and action converged. It codified the aspirations, grievances, and principles that had been cultivated over more than a decade of tension with Britain. It transformed a regional rebellion into a national struggle with international significance. And it provided both the Continental Congress and the Continental Army with a clear articulation of purpose, moral authority, and legitimacy. Independence was no longer a distant aspiration. It was a declared reality, with all the risks, responsibilities, and opportunities that such a declaration entailed. By declaring independence, the 13 colonies signaled to the world and to themselves that they were committed to forging a new political order, grounded in principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance. The Declaration united citizens under a common cause, provided a rallying point for the Continental Army, and established the colonies as legitimate actors on the global stage. It was a bold statement, a declaration of intent, and a moral challenge to the world's most powerful empire. In essence, it transformed the American Revolution from a conflict of arms into a revolution of ideas, setting the stage for the global, ideological, and military struggles that would follow. The Revolution's early years were defined by survival, improvisation, and the relentless testing of the Continental Army against a far superior British force. By 1777, the struggle had reached a critical juncture. The fledgling United States, still fragile and fractured, faced a conflict that was evolving from a regional rebellion into a confrontation with global implications. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure would mean the collapse of the revolutionary cause, the reassertion of British authority, and the end of any aspirations for self-governance. Success, however, offered the possibility of not only independence, but also international recognition and legitimacy. It was within this high-stakes environment that the Battle of Saratoga emerged, a turning point that would alter the course of the American Revolution. In the early months of 1777, British military strategy focused on dividing and conquering the colonies. A complex plan was devised to isolate New England, the epicenter of revolutionary activity, from the rest of the 13 colonies. British General John Burgoyne, an aristocrat and career officer, was tasked with advancing south from Canada along the Hudson River, linking with forces under General Howe in New York City, and thereby splitting the rebellion geographically. The strategy appeared sound in theory: overwhelming force, coordinated movement, and a rigid adherence to conventional European tactics promised to crush colonial resistance. Yet, as history would demonstrate, the execution of this plan was flawed by overconfidence, logistical miscalculations, and a profound underestimation of the Continental Army's resilience and strategic ingenuity. Burgoyne's advance began in June 1777. His army, numbering approximately 8,000 troops, included British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, and Loyalist units. He moved south through the forests and river valleys of upstate New York, carrying with him artillery, wagons, and supplies. The terrain, however, proved more challenging than anticipated. Dense forests, swamps, and poorly maintained roads slowed the army's progress and left it vulnerable to ambush. American forces, familiar with the landscape and motivated by the defense of their homes, seized these opportunities. Skirmishes, harassment of supply lines, and destruction of bridges and roads gradually wore down Burgoyne's forces, creating delays and forcing him to stretch his army thin across a widening front. Opposing Burgoyne were American forces under the command of Horatio Gates, with significant contributions from leaders such as Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan. Gates, a cautious and methodical commander, focused on fortifying positions, gathering intelligence, and leveraging local militias to create strategic choke points. Morgan's riflemen, adept at guerrilla tactics and skilled in sharpshooting, disrupted British formations and inflicted disproportionate casualties. This combination of conventional defensive positioning, irregular warfare, and strategic use of terrain exemplified the evolving American approach to military engagement: flexible, adaptive, and attuned to both opportunity and necessity. The confrontation culminated in a series of engagements around Saratoga in September and October 1777. Two critical battles, Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, demonstrated the Americans' ability to absorb initial British attacks and then counter with precision. At Freeman's Farm, Burgoyne's troops faced entrenched American positions, suffering significant losses without achieving a decisive breakthrough. By the time of the second engagement at Bemis Heights, the Americans had consolidated reinforcements, including additional militia and Continental Army units, and were prepared to press their advantage. Benedict Arnold, disregarding orders to remain in a subordinate role, took decisive action on the battlefield, rallying troops and leading counterattacks that turned the tide of combat. His audacity, combined with the disciplined execution of the American forces, compelled Burgoyne to recognize that his position was untenable. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne formally surrendered his army at Saratoga. Approximately 5,800 British troops became prisoners, while the Americans captured artillery, supplies, and a significant morale boost. The victory was monumental in both practical and symbolic terms. It demonstrated that the Continental Army, despite its previous hardships, could achieve a decisive triumph over professional European forces. It validated the strategic approach that combined conventional and irregular tactics, and it underscored the importance of leadership, coordination, and local support. Saratoga marked the first time the revolution had decisively altered the strategic balance in favor of the colonies. The impact of Saratoga extended far beyond the battlefield. The victory was closely observed by European powers, particularly France, which had been covertly supplying the Americans with funds, arms, and advisors. The news of Burgoyne's surrender convinced French leadership that the American cause was credible and capable of success. In February 1778, France formalized its alliance with the United States through the Treaty of Alliance, providing troops, naval support, and financial assistance. Spain and the Netherlands would follow indirectly, further internationalizing the conflict and transforming the revolution from a regional rebellion into a global confrontation with imperial dimensions. French involvement brought more than just material support, it brought legitimacy. The recognition by a major European power signaled to other nations that the United States was a sovereign entity capable of engaging in diplomatic and military affairs. French officers, including Marquis de Lafayette, joined the Continental Army, providing both expertise and morale support. French naval power, particularly in controlling key waterways and supporting sieges, became instrumental in subsequent campaigns. The Revolution, once largely an internal struggle within the British Empire, now became a theater in which multiple empires competed for advantage, with the 13 colonies at the center. The alliance with France also allowed the Continental Congress to undertake more ambitious strategic planning. Resources, intelligence, and diplomatic channels expanded, enabling coordinated efforts across multiple fronts. The southern colonies, initially less involved in direct combat, became theaters of engagement as British strategies shifted to exploit perceived loyalist support. The integration of European military advisors and supplies required the Continental Army to adapt, learning to incorporate foreign expertise while maintaining operational independence. This period highlighted the interplay between domestic resilience and international diplomacy, demonstrating that revolutionary success depended as much on alliances and political strategy as on battlefield victories. The significance of Saratoga extended into the political realm as well. It emboldened American leaders to pursue independence with renewed vigor, reinforcing the principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence. The victory strengthened the resolve of both soldiers and civilians, proving that sustained resistance could yield tangible results. It also reshaped British perceptions of the conflict. The Crown recognized that suppressing the rebellion would require not only military might, but a commitment to a prolonged and costly global engagement. The balance of power had shifted, and the revolution was no longer a peripheral disturbance. It was a credible and escalating threat to imperial authority. Moreover, Saratoga demonstrated the importance of unity, coordination, and morale. Local militias, Continental Army units, and foreign volunteers had worked in concert to achieve a shared objective, despite differences in training, experience, and social background. Communication, intelligence, and rapid adaptation proved decisive. The victory illustrated that effective resistance could be achieved not merely through numbers or superior equipment, but through strategy, ingenuity, and collective determination. This lesson would echo throughout the remainder of the Revolution, informing campaigns in the South, the Chesapeake, and ultimately at Yorktown. The broader consequences of Saratoga also had a psychological dimension. For American colonists, the triumph provided a tangible affirmation that independence was attainable. It strengthened the perception that the Revolution was not merely a defensive struggle, but a proactive endeavor capable of reshaping the world order. For Britain, it exposed vulnerabilities in assumptions about colonial loyalty, military superiority, and the ease of suppressing rebellion. The surrender at Saratoga challenged traditional notions of European military invincibility and demonstrated that localized knowledge, strategic innovation, and ideological commitment could offset conventional advantages. Saratoga also cemented the reputation of key American leaders. Benedict Arnold, despite later controversy, demonstrated battlefield audacity and tactical ingenuity. Horatio Gates, despite his cautious approach, played a crucial role in consolidating forces and maintaining strategic coherence. George Washington, observing these developments, absorbed the lessons of combined operations, coordination of militia and continental forces, and the integration of Allied support, lessons that would inform his subsequent campaigns in the Southern Theater and at Yorktown. Leadership, both on the battlefield and within political structures, emerged as a decisive factor in the revolution's trajectory. The alliance with France following Saratoga had enduring implications for the conduct of the war. French military engineers, artillery, and logistical support allowed the Continental Army to undertake operations previously impossible. French naval forces contested British control of the Atlantic and coastal regions, enabling critical troop movements and sieges. The infusion of resources extended the revolution beyond a North American rebellion into a global conflict, compelling Britain to divert attention and forces to multiple theaters. The revolutionary struggle, once constrained geographically, now had international significance, with implications for European power dynamics, colonial holdings, and the balance of imperial authority. Saratoga, therefore, was more than a military victory. It was a fulcrum upon which the American Revolution pivoted from precarious survival to credible insurgency. It validated the strategic vision of American commanders, galvanized civilian and military support, and secured alliances that would prove decisive in subsequent years. It marked the moment when the colonies' struggle for self-determination acquired the resources, legitimacy, and international recognition necessary to sustain a protracted conflict. The revolution, once a regional rebellion, had become a credible force capable of challenging the British Empire on multiple fronts. In the broader narrative of the American Revolution, the events surrounding Saratoga illustrate the convergence of strategy, leadership, diplomacy, and ideology. They exemplify how local knowledge, adaptability, and morale can offset disparities in training and resources. They highlight the interplay between military success and political legitimacy, and they underscore the critical role of international alliances in the trajectory of revolutionary movements. Saratoga stands as a testament to the possibility of turning adversity into opportunity, of transforming a seemingly hopeless struggle into a decisive victory with global consequences. It was the point at which the American Revolution truly began to tilt the balance of history. By 1780, the American Revolution had entered a critical and turbulent phase. The initial theaters of conflict in the northern colonies had demonstrated the Continental Army's resilience and capacity to challenge British forces, yet the war was far from over. The British, reeling from the defeat at Saratoga and the formal entry of France into the war, shifted their strategic focus southward. They believed that the southern colonies, where Loyalist sentiment remained relatively strong, offered an opportunity to regain momentum, recruit local support, and fracture the revolution from within. This Southern strategy would test the ingenuity, endurance, and adaptability of American forces as never before, transforming the revolution into a brutal, decentralized conflict that blurred the lines between conventional and guerrilla warfare. The British Southern Campaign began with the capture of Charleston, South Carolina, in May 1780, a triumph that marked one of the largest surrenders of American forces during the war. Under General Sir Henry Clinton, British forces laid siege to the city, employing artillery and naval support to force a capitulation. Over 5,000 American troops, under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln, were captured. The loss of Charleston was a significant blow, both materially and psychologically, to the revolutionary cause. It exposed vulnerabilities in the Southern defenses and demonstrated that conventional engagements in open cities could be perilous for American forces when facing superior numbers and siege capabilities. Yet, the fall of Charleston did not extinguish resistance. Rather, it set the stage for a new form of warfare adapted to the Southern landscape. American resistance in the South relied heavily on guerrilla tactics, localized militias, and adaptive leadership. Figures such as Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, used knowledge of terrain, mobility, and surprise to harass British supply lines, disrupt communication, and conduct hit-and-run attacks that frustrated conventional forces. Marion's methods exemplified a broader pattern in the Southern theater. Conventional battles were often costly or indecisive, but persistent, irregular operations could wear down the enemy, maintain American presence, and sustain local morale. These tactics, combined with political organization and intelligence networks, allowed the revolution to endure despite repeated setbacks in major engagements. The Battle of Kings Mountain, on October 7, 1780, exemplified the effectiveness of militia-led operations. Patriot militias, primarily composed of frontier settlers from the Appalachian region, engaged a force of Loyalist troops under Major Patrick Ferguson. Utilizing the rugged terrain to their advantage, the militias executed flanking maneuvers and targeted sharpshooting that decimated Ferguson's forces. The victory at Kings Mountain was pivotal. It eliminated a key Loyalist threat, reinvigorated revolutionary morale in the Southern colonies, and demonstrated that local forces, highly motivated and intimately familiar with the land, could decisively challenge British authority. Kings Mountain was a psychological and strategic turning point, signaling that the Southern campaign would not proceed as smoothly as British planners had anticipated. Following Kings Mountain, the Southern theater remained a dynamic and contested space. Nathanael Greene, appointed by George Washington as the commander of the Southern Department of the Continental Army, took a strategic approach that balanced caution with aggression. Recognizing the limitations of his forces in confrontation with British regulars, Greene employed a strategy of mobility, avoidance of pitched battles when disadvantageous, and targeted engagements designed to wear down the enemy. His campaigns through North and South Carolina, often coordinated with militia leaders like Daniel Morgan and local partisan units, relied on rapid marches, supply line disruption, and tactical withdrawals that preserved his forces while inflicting cumulative losses on British troops. Greene's leadership transformed the Southern theater into a war of attrition, leveraging the geography, civilian support, and flexibility of American forces to offset British advantages in numbers and firepower. One of Greene's most notable maneuvers was the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, fought on March 15, 1781, in North Carolina. Although technically a British tactical victory under General Cornwallis, the engagement came at a staggering cost. British forces suffered heavy casualties, depleting their effective strength for subsequent operations. Greene's strategy of engaging in calculated resistance and then withdrawing preserved his army while maximizing the attrition of British forces. Guilford Courthouse exemplified the emerging pattern of American strategy. Victory was not always measured by battlefield conquest, but by the erosion of enemy capability and the preservation of one's own operational potential. As the Southern Campaign unfolded, the interplay between American and French forces grew increasingly significant. The Franco-American alliance, established following Saratoga, provided critical resources, including troops, naval power, and supplies. French forces, such as those commanded by Count de Rochambeau, coordinated with Washington and Greene to create joint operational plans, culminating in the eventual encirclement of Cornwallis at Yorktown. French naval superiority, demonstrated in the blockade of Chesapeake Bay, prevented British reinforcements and escape by sea, transforming the theater into a strategically advantageous position for the Americans. The collaboration between American and French forces showcased the integration of international diplomacy, military coordination, and local initiative, highlighting the multifaceted nature of revolutionary success. The culmination of the Southern and Chesapeake campaigns occurred at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. Cornwallis, having advanced into the peninsula, found his forces isolated and vulnerable. Washington, Greene, and Rochambeau orchestrated a siege that combined land-based encirclement with naval blockade. The Continental Army, augmented by French troops, established artillery positions and trench lines, gradually constricting British movements and cutting off supplies. Over several weeks, the pressure mounted, morale declined, and strategic options narrowed. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis formally surrendered his army, totaling approximately 7,000 troops. The surrender at Yorktown was decisive. It effectively ended major British operations in North America and marked the near completion of American military objectives. The significance of Yorktown extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Militarily, it demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated operations, the combined Franco-American strategy, and the integration of conventional and irregular tactics. Politically, it solidified American claims to sovereignty and strengthened the position of negotiators in subsequent peace talks. Psychologically, it reinforced the notion that a small, determined, and strategically agile nation could triumph over one of the world's preeminent military powers. The surrender symbolized not only the end of active combat, but also the validation of years of strategic, ideological, and logistical effort by the Continental Congress, military leaders, and civilian population. Throughout the Southern campaigns, the Revolution showcased the dynamic interplay between geography, local knowledge, and strategic innovation. American forces adapted to forests, swamps, rivers, and mountains, exploiting terrain to offset conventional disadvantages. Militias played a crucial role in maintaining resistance in contested regions, while the Continental Army engaged in selective engagements designed to preserve strength and wear down the enemy. Leadership at all levels, from Washington and Greene to Marion and Morgan, was characterized by flexibility, foresight, and responsiveness, creating a decentralized yet coherent operational structure capable of sustaining a protracted struggle. The Southern theater also illuminated the broader social dimensions of the Revolution. Local populations were actively engaged, providing supplies, intelligence, and sanctuary. The conflict blurred the boundaries between military and civilian spheres, as homes, farms, and communities became both resources and battlegrounds. Loyalist activity, while significant, was countered by a combination of militia action, political organization, and strategic communication. The revolutionary cause relied not only on military engagement, but also on the cultivation of allegiance, legitimacy, and participation among the populace. The war, in this sense, was total, encompassing ideology, governance, and the daily lives of citizens across contested regions. By the conclusion of the Southern campaigns and the victory at Yorktown, the trajectory of the Revolution had fundamentally shifted. The British Empire, while still formidable, faced the reality that suppressing the American rebellion would require an extended, costly, and uncertain commitment. The Continental Army, strengthened by experience, international support, and strategic acumen, had transitioned from a precarious insurgent force into a credible national military capable of securing independence. The alliance with France, combined with the effective use of local militias and adaptable leadership, underscored the revolution's multidimensional nature, blending military prowess, diplomacy, and ideological coherence. Yorktown, in particular, symbolized the culmination of years of perseverance, ingenuity, and ideological commitment. It was the moment when the revolution, fought across diverse theaters and through complex social, political, and military landscapes, coalesced into a decisive achievement. The surrender of Cornwallis marked not only the cessation of major hostilities, but also the affirmation of American strategic vision, the efficacy of Franco-American cooperation, and the resilience of a population committed to the principles of independence, liberty, and self-determination. The Southern campaigns in Yorktown also established enduring lessons about the nature of revolutionary warfare. Success was achieved not solely through brute force, but through adaptation, coalition building, and strategic patience. Local knowledge, flexibility, and the integration of irregular and conventional forces proved decisive. Morale, leadership, and the alignment of ideological purpose with operational execution were as critical as muskets and artillery. These lessons would inform the nascent United States in subsequent years, shaping military doctrine, political organization, and national identity. In the broader sweep of history, the Southern campaigns and the victory at Yorktown demonstrated that revolutions are seldom linear or predictable. They require resilience in the face of setbacks, creativity in response to material limitations, and the ability to mobilize both domestic and international support. The American Revolution, through these campaigns, illustrated the convergence of local initiative, strategic planning, and global diplomacy. It showed that a determined population, guided by coherent leadership and supported by allies, could fundamentally alter the course of history. As the dust settled in 1781, the revolution had achieved what few had imagined at its outset. A small, determined confederation of colonies had effectively neutralized one of the world's most powerful armies, secured crucial alliances, and demonstrated that ideological commitment, strategic innovation, and coordinated effort could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The Southern campaigns in Yorktown were not merely military successes. They were the culmination of a revolution that fused political, social, and military dimensions into a coherent struggle for independence. The stage was set for the final steps in achieving recognition, negotiation, and the formal establishment of the United States as a sovereign nation. By the autumn of 1783, the American Revolution had concluded, though its consequences would reverberate across the globe for generations. The formal signing of the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783, marked the end of 8 years of relentless conflict, from the first shots at Lexington and Concord to the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. The treaty, negotiated by American diplomats including John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, compelled Great Britain to recognize the independence of the 13 colonies, ceding territory east of the Mississippi River and formally acknowledging the United States as a sovereign nation. The achievement of independence was monumental, but the legacy of the Revolution extended far beyond the mere establishment of political boundaries. The Revolution's success was not inevitable, nor was it the result of raw military might alone. The Continental Army, often under-resourced, faced shortages of food, weapons, and clothing, and yet endured years of campaigns that tested the limits of human resilience. Civilians, too, played a critical role, supplying intelligence, provisions, and shelter while managing the economic and social upheavals of wartime. Women, enslaved peoples, Native American nations, and Loyalists all experienced the Revolution in distinct and often conflicting ways, each navigating a landscape of shifting allegiances, opportunities, and threats. Their contributions, sacrifices, and sufferings shaped the character of the emerging nation, underscoring that the revolution was as much a social transformation as a military and political one. The American Revolution also represented a profound ideological shift. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that individuals possess inalienable rights, challenged centuries of monarchical authority and colonial hierarchy. These ideas, once radical in the context of the 18th century Atlantic world, became guiding precepts for the fledgling United States. They shaped political discourse, informed the drafting of state constitutions, and ultimately influenced the creation of the United States Constitution in 1787, which sought to balance liberty, governance, and the rule of law. The Treaty of Paris, while ending hostilities with Britain, also underscored the complexities of international diplomacy. France, Spain, and the Netherlands had entered the war at different stages, each pursuing strategic interests that were sometimes aligned and sometimes in tension with American objectives. France's support had been decisive, providing naval power, troops, and financial assistance, yet the negotiations in Paris required careful navigation of competing demands. John Jay's insistence on negotiating directly with Britain, rather than solely through France, reflected a keen understanding of the nascent nation's interests and the need to assert independence not only militarily, but diplomatically. The resulting treaty secured favorable terms, territorial gains, and recognition of sovereignty, laying the foundation for the United States' future as an independent actor on the global stage. The revolution's conclusion did not bring immediate peace or stability within the new nation. Economic disruption, debt, and social divisions created pressing challenges. Soldiers returning from the field faced unpaid wages and uncertain futures. Loyalists, many of whom had remained faithful to the crown, fled to Canada, the Caribbean, or Britain, leaving behind property and communities. Native American nations, often caught between colonial and British forces, faced dispossession and marginalization in the post-war landscape. Enslaved peoples, who had contributed to both British and American efforts, encountered a tenuous freedom. The revolutionary ideals of liberty coexisted uneasily with the institution of slavery. The American Revolution, while victorious, was thus a revolution in progress, a transformation whose promises would require continued struggle and negotiation. The international impact of the revolution was profound and immediate. The successful defiance of a global empire inspired other movements for independence and reform. In Europe, intellectuals and political leaders closely studied the American experience, examining the interplay of ideology, insurgency, and diplomacy. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, drew inspiration from the American example, adopting and adapting principles of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty. Latin American independence movements in the early 19th century also cited the American Revolution as a precedent, demonstrating that the struggle of a small population against an established imperial power could achieve tangible, transformative results. The revolution, therefore, became a global reference point, a proof of concept for the possibilities of self-determination and constitutional governance. The legacy of leadership during the Revolution further shaped the emerging United States. Figures such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams exemplified the intertwining of military, political, and intellectual effort that had propelled the colonies to success. Washington's steadfastness, strategic insight, and moral authority not only secured battlefield victories, but also provided a unifying symbol for a fledgling nation. Jefferson's articulation of ideals in the Declaration of Independence offered a vision of governance and rights that transcended immediate military objectives. Franklin's diplomatic skill, particularly in securing French support, underscored the importance of international engagement in achieving national goals. These leaders, while imperfect and often constrained by the social and political norms of their time, established a foundation for governance, diplomacy, and civic identity that would endure long after the last musket was fired. Culturally, the Revolution fostered a sense of shared identity among the former colonies. Despite regional, economic, and social differences, the experience of collective struggle against a common adversary created bonds that transcended prior allegiances. Symbols such as the Liberty Pole, the rattlesnake, and the Continental Congress itself became emblems of unity, resistance, and shared purpose. Civic participation, political debate, and the experience of self-governance during wartime prepared citizens for the responsibilities of Republican citizenship. The Revolution was as much a social experiment as a military endeavor, embedding the notion that governance required engagement, accountability, and adherence to principle. Economically, the war imposed both hardship and opportunity. Trade disruptions, inflation, and wartime scarcity challenged ordinary Americans, while the departure of Loyalists opened space for new land ownership and entrepreneurial activity. The Revolution accelerated discussions about property rights, commerce, and taxation in ways that would influence the political economy of the United States for decades. Military service, participation in governance, and exposure to revolutionary ideology reshaped perceptions. The Revolution also generated profound legal and constitutional developments. In the immediate post-war period, states drafted constitutions that codified principles of separation of powers, checks and balances, and individual rights. These state constitutions served as laboratories for experimentation, influencing the subsequent drafting of the Federal Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The American Revolution thus laid the groundwork for a system of governance that combined representative democracy with protections for individual liberty, establishing legal and institutional precedents that would guide the new nation through internal and external challenges. Internationally, the Revolution reshaped the balance of power. Britain, while retaining vast imperial holdings, was forced to recalibrate its approach to colonial governance. The loss of the 13 colonies prompted reforms in administration, finance, and military strategy throughout the empire. European powers observed the efficacy of insurgency, ideological appeal, and strategic alliances, recalibrating their expectations for conflicts both within and outside their empires. The Revolution had demonstrated that military supremacy alone was insufficient to maintain control over distant populations when faced with sustained resistance grounded in ideology, local knowledge, and external support. The ideological resonance of the Revolution extended beyond the immediate geopolitical consequences. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, reinforced by the lived experience of war, provided a framework for ongoing debates about equality, liberty, and governance. While the new nation struggled with contradictions, particularly regarding slavery, Native American dispossession, and gender inequality, the revolutionary ideals established enduring benchmarks against which societal progress could be measured. The American Revolution, therefore, was both a historical event and a continuing moral and political project, shaping discourse, aspiration, and reform well into the future. Ultimately, the American Revolution was a transformative episode in human history. It demonstrated that a coalition of committed, strategically agile, and ideologically motivated actors could challenge a dominant imperial power and succeed. It illustrated the interplay between military strategy, political organization, diplomacy, and social cohesion. It affirmed the power of ideas, liberty, equality, and self-determination to inspire action, shape alliances, and influence the trajectory of nations. The revolution did not end with the cessation of hostilities. Its legacy continued in the creation of constitutional governance, the evolution of civic identity, and the global ripple effects on subsequent struggles for independence and human rights. The formal recognition of American independence in 1783 was not merely a legal milestone, but a culmination of years of endurance, ingenuity, and ideological commitment. The 13 colonies, once considered distant and minor appendages of a global empire, had emerged as a new nation capable of asserting its sovereignty, navigating international relations, and establishing principles of governance grounded in popular consent. The revolution demonstrated that the course of history could be altered through a combination of determination, strategic foresight, and moral clarity. The world had witnessed the rise of a nation born not of conquest or dynastic inheritance, but of collective resolve and a shared vision for liberty. In reflecting upon the revolution's legacy, it becomes clear that the conflict achieved more than the separation of colonies from an empire. It inaugurated a new epoch in political thought, social organization, and international relations. The American Revolution revealed the potential of human agency in reshaping governance, the capacity of ideological commitment to mobilize populations, and the importance of resilience in the face of adversity. It stands as a testament to the power of principles translated into action, of vision combined with strategy, and of a people united in pursuit of self-determination against formidable odds. By 1783, the revolution had transformed the landscape of North America, established the foundations of a new nation, and inspired movements worldwide. Its lessons, victories, and contradictions would inform the United States' development, influence global political thought, and continue to resonate as a defining example of the capacity for ordinary individuals and communities to challenge established authority, assert sovereignty, and craft a vision for a more just and self-governing society. The American Revolution, in its military, ideological, and societal dimensions, had reshaped history, proving that even the most powerful empire could be confronted, and ultimately, that the aspirations of a determined people could endure and triumph.